Metaphor versus metonymy. This week we're talking about tropes and figures in poetry. And two of the primary tropes in poetry are metaphor and metonymy. Some critics have said that there are four primary tropes in poetry: metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, and irony. Talk about synecdoche and irony another time. Metaphor and metonymy have, throughout the 20th century, throughout the second half of the 20th century, have often been opposed to one another, not only as literary tropes or figures of speech, but as ways of making sense of the world. Roman Jakobson, a linguist and literary theorist, said that metaphor is a figure of speech that relies upon the similarities of things. A famous and cliched metaphor would be the first line of the Robert Burns poem, "My love is a red, red rose," where if we think of love, what do we think of? We think of passion, we think of bodily energy, we perhaps think of lust, we think of blood rising, we think of blood being red, we think of the beauty that we might want to pursue. All of these qualities we feel in our bodies when we feel love might remind us of the rose. The rose is blood red. The rose is traditionally associated with beauty. We could take it further and say that when we are intensely in love, yes, our blood is up, but also there's something painful and risky about being madly in love. And certainly the pain and the risk are also suggested by the rose with its thorns. Now, to equate love with the rose, even though it is a metaphor, it is a cliche. It's a dead metaphor, meaning it's not poetically interesting at all, but it illustrates how a metaphor works. Now, a more complicated way a metaphor works would be to think of William Blake's poem, The Sick Rose, where he too talks about the rose as being connected to love, but in Blake's poem, the rose is not simply a symbol of love. It has more complicated feelings associated with it. And the poem is brief. It goes like this: "O rose, thou art sick. The invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy." So the rose here is a metaphor for what? Well, we would have to think that through. Is the rose a metaphor for a sick heart? Is the rose a metaphor for some sort of destructive love? And what is the rose's relationship to the invisible worm that flies in the night? There's something clearly sexual going on here. The point is that Blake here generates a metaphor that is a metaphor that is alive because it's striking and interesting. It shows us relationships that we probably did not apprehend before. The rose allows Blake to explore psychological processes that he probably could not explore without the metaphor of the rose. And ideally, this is what a metaphor does in a poem. It allows the poet, to compare one thing to another in such a way that both things are seen in fresh lights. Great example of this would, of course, be John Donne's poem, The Flea, which we read for today, where John Donne imagines a flea as a temple in which two people lie together and have sex after they are married. So, wow, that's difficult to imagine, and we'll talk about Donne's metaphor making called conceits in class. But to imagine two humans getting married and making love inside a flea, we suddenly see a flea in a much different way, and certainly we see the humans making love in a much different way too. So this is how a metaphor can work. It brings together two dissimilar things in such a way that both things are seen in a new light because of the relationship. So, going back to my initial remarks, Roman Jakobson says that metaphor is a trope that marks relationships between similar things. I said dissimilar things just a minute ago. What I should have said is things that on the surface may seem dissimilar, but are actually shown to be quite similar. That's what a really striking metaphor will do. And so for this reason, Jakobson claims that the metaphor is suited well to poetry, in particular to lyric poetry, in particular to the lyric poetry of the Romantic Age. You ask yourself, what is the nightingale of Keats a metaphor for? What is the urn of Keats a metaphor for? What is the albatross of Coleridge a metaphor for? And so on and so forth. Now, metonymy is quite different. It doesn't mark similarity between two things. It simply marks contiguity between two things. Two things are simply beside each other in such a way that one thing can substitute for the other. So we can think, to give a very basic example, of calling a lunch the blue plate special. Now, when I was growing up, oftentimes you go to a diner and the lunch special would be called the blue plate special. Well, why? Well, because perhaps over time, lunch was simply served in a plate that was blue. Totally arbitrary, totally random. And eventually, because of that contiguity, the blue plate started substituting for lunch. You see how that works? We can think of another fairly obvious example. Sometimes the whole movie industry is referred to as Hollywood. Well, this again is totally arbitrary. The whole movie production conglomeration simply grew up in a place called Hollywood. And over time, eventually, the word Hollywood could come to substitute for all motion picture production. So that's how metonymy works. And given that metonymy is based on arbitrary connections, based on things that simply happen to be side by side in such a way that one can possibly substitute for another, because of this, metonymy is much more open to how time actually works. It's a much more temporal trope. How does time work? It works paratactically. That's a fancy adverb. A paratactic relationship is a relationship between two things in language in which no conjunctions are used, or in which the conjunction and might be used. So parataxis is a way of describing a certain kind of human experience. I went to the store and I saw some eggs and I bought the eggs and I dropped one and I was upset and someone cleaned it up and I checked out and I took my eggs home and I cooked my eggs and I ate them and I took a nap. That's one way to inhabit time paratactically. All those different units that are beside one another, I could substitute one for the other. So over time, dropping an egg might come to mean to me, I don't know, whatever mood I had that day. Well, I didn't add that into my paratactical string, but let's say that that day I was feeling really depressed and I dropped an egg. Well, because I dropped an egg on a day I was depressed, I might eventually say, oh, well, I dropped an egg, which means I'm depressed. So you see how that works? So for Jakobson, the metonymy is not only more temporal, it's also associated with realistic fiction. Realistic fiction, which really tries to kind of capture the flow of time as it's actually lived. On the other extreme, according to Jakobson, metaphor would be a more spatial kind of form, where you imagine that two things are kind of almost melding with one another. Two things are merging into one another, whereas in metonymy, to some extent, the metonymy marks where things are different from one another. So metaphor is probably much more likely to occur in lyric poetry, Jakobson's right, and in the poems that we read for today, the poems that exemplify metaphor are indeed lyrical poems, except for Donne's poem, which is a kind of dramatic monologue. Stephen's Anecdote of the Jar we'll talk about as a poem with metonymy tomorrow. But I want to talk now about two of the great poets of metonymy, Walt Whitman and Frank O'Hara. We've read Frank O'Hara before, one of my favorite poets. And he and Whitman both were great poets of the city. They loved to walk around New York City and just sort of take in whatever happens next. To do this is to be what Charles Baudelaire, the great mid-19th century French poet, would call to be a flaneur, F-L-A-N-E-U-R, flaneur, who is someone who just walks in the city for the sake of walking in the city, not going anywhere, just out to have interesting experiences. You can also be a flaneuse, female. French is a gendered language. But Whitman would just kind of stroll around the city and see what he saw. And he tried to capture this motion in his poetry in such a way that whatever he saw, he would feel such empathy with that he would sort of become what he saw and sort of substitute himself for what he saw. So in this way, Whitman would qualify as an eminently metonymic poet. Oh, here I am. Oh, there's that. That's so interesting. Oh, let's check it out. Oh, I almost feel like I am that thing. I am that thing. And then he would move on. And so we see in his famous poem, Song of Myself, an example of this where we see Whitman's speaker in the poem move through all these different experiences through a walk in the city. He says, "The suicide sprawls on the bloody floor of the bedroom. I witness the corpse with its dabbled hair. I note where the pistol has fallen. The blab of the pave, tires of carts, slough of boat soles, talk of the promenaders, the heavy omnibus, the driver with his interrogating thumb, the clank of the shod horses on the granite floor, the snow sleighs clinking, shouted jokes, pelts of snowballs, the hurrahs for popular favorites, the fury of roused mobs, the flap of the curtain litter, a sick man inside borne to the hospital, and so on. Arrest of criminals, slights, adulterous offers made, acceptances, rejections with convex lips. I mind them, or the show or resonance of them. I come and I depart." So there's such an identification with each of these sites that Whitman feels as if he is one with that site and can substitute himself for that site. That's a metonymic move. And appropriately, it is a move that marks parataxis. Whitman's move through the city marking, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, etc., etc., etc. So Whitman's great disciple in the 20th century, well, there were really two. One was Allen Ginsberg. We've looked at Allen Ginsberg. The other was the great Frank O'Hara, who wrote some of his best poems, his lunch poems, on his lunch hour. He worked at Museum of Modern Art, and he would come out lunchtime and walk around the city or sit outside the MoMA and watch things. And he was just very attuned to what he saw and marked what he saw in the same way that Whitman marked what he saw, and so creates a kind of metonymic style of constant, here this is, I'm so interested in it, I kind of identify with that thing right this moment. I substitute myself for that thing right this moment. I'll move on to something else. So if in Whitman, there are times when Whitman actually says, I am this, I am this, I am this. In Frank O'Hara, the metonymy is a little more subtle. There's a sense that he just sort of, oh, that happened. That's kind of a marker for who I am at that point. Kind of a metonymy, then that happened, then that happened. In other words, Whitman suggests a kind of pantheism sometimes, as if he is everywhere all the time. There's something lighter and more playful and more hesitant about Frank O'Hara. But Frank O'Hara, in his famous poem, The Day Lady Died, which is his poem about hearing about the death of the great singer, 20th century singer Billie Holiday for the first time, Note how he opens the poem. It is 2:20 in New York, a Friday, 3 days after Bastille Day. Yes, it is 1959, and I go get a shoe shine because I will get off the 419 in East Hampton at 7:15 and then go straight to dinner, and I don't know the people who will feed me. I walk up the muggy street beginning to sun and have a hamburger and a malted and buy an ugly New World writing to see what poets in Ghana are doing these days. I go on to the bank, and Miss Stillwagon, first name Linda, I once heard, doesn't even look up my balance for once in her life, and in the Golden Griffin I get a little Verlaine for Patsy. And he goes on to talk about other things he's doing on this Friday afternoon. Um, and for another friend, Mike, I just stroll into the Park Lane and liquor store and ask for a bottle of Strega, and then I go back to where I came from to 6th Avenue and the tobacconist in the Ziegfeld Theater, and casually ask for a carton of Gauloise and a carton of Picayunes and a New York Post with her face on it. And I am sweating a lot by now and thinking of leaning on the John door in the 5 spot while she whispered a song along the keyboard to Mal Waldron, and everyone and I stopped breathing. So what makes this poem so remarkable is there's this metonymic flow, this paratactical marking of all these things that are just happening. And then at the very end, when he sees in the newspaper, the New York Post, that Billie Holiday has died, he remembers a time when he saw her and she was singing to her then pianist, Mal Waldron, and everyone and I stopped breathing. So interestingly, he ends this eminently metonymic poem with a very striking metaphor where he talks about how Billie Holiday, when she was alive, was so powerful a singer that everyone listening to her stopped breathing. Breath here symbolizing what? Life, flow, and suddenly to stop suggests the power is such that everything is brought to a kind of period, slowed down, ceased, and then can start again. And of course, the stopping of breathing also points to the fact that Billie Holiday has stopped breathing, and also points to the fact that O'Hara in this poem feels as if he has sort of stopped breathing because of the sorrow he has felt. So I wanted to point out this poem by Frank O'Hara, The Day the Lady Died. Again, to read a poem that is metonymic in spirit. If Whitman's long catalogs from his walks around the city feel more officially metonymic because he can substitute himself for whatever he comes up against, whatever he's contiguous with, O'Hara's poem is more metonymic in spirit, in that he feels such an identification with the things that he experiences that it's almost as if these things become markers for who he is at that moment. But what happens is that parataxis stops, that the time of the poem kind of stops appropriately with a metaphor. That metaphor which pushes against metonymy and suggests a relationship that goes much deeper than mere arbitrary contiguity, but a deep similarity among all those who heard Billie Holiday sing stopping breathing, and among all those who will mourn Billie Holiday stopping breathing. The fact that Billie Holiday herself literally stopped breathing, dying. So that is a lecture on metaphor and metonymy.